Every transformation you've led this year will have had a body count, not of people, but of expectations. The promotion someone didn't get, the role and algorithm changed, the version of the leader that they can no longer be. We call it change, and today's guest calls it grief. And she thinks we're paying for not naming it. Welcome to Let's Talk Transformation. This is Susie Lewis, your host, and my guest today is someone who makes life and death decisions under uncertainty for a living and also runs a company. Dr. Angela Fusaro is an emergency medicine physician in Atlanta and the co-founder and CEO of Physician 360. She's spent her career at the intersection of ER medicine, healthcare innovation, and entrepreneurship, which means for me, she's probably one of the best qualified people to talk about bravery, grief, and leadership identity. So in this episode, we'll be looking at how grief shows up in organizations, how it affects leaders and teams, the myth of vulnerability and what that means for leadership identity, as well as the effect of AI on this whole human landscape and how we can harness courage, vulnerability, and grief for business growth. Angela, welcome to Let's Talk Transformation.
Thank you, Susie, for having me. Very
It's,
excited to talk today.
yeah, likewise, it's an absolute pleasure. And Angela, before we get into the big stuff in inverted commas, let me just start with what did working in the emergency room teach you about leadership that no business school ever could?
Ooh. Yeah, there is a surprising amount of parallel in those environments. Um, I think one of the things that that comes to mind that is most relevant for what we're talking about today is in my clinical work, when people hear about grief, and I saw a lot of that and I continue to see a lot of that in that capacity, traditional grief,
Yes.
we think about being comfortable with the loss of human life.
Yeah.
And that is a skill. That is something that um, you train to become comfortable with. But what I started to notice was that there was this other type of grief in that environment, non-traditional grief that is really more about when things don't go as you expect them to.
Mm.
And that that type of grief, we were coexisting with it in all types of way in my clinical life. And I made the connection that that type of grief, that deviation from expectation, really exists in all of our professional settings, and it's impacting how our teams show up. And I think that would not have been as obvious to me outside my work as an ER doctor.
And I love that parallel because we all tend, don't we? And that's the brain, that's our human magnificent brains, is to sort of block things off into silos and sort of class them into manageable pieces. And I think, we don't make these parallels often enough between two completely different sectors that can have exactly the same human reaction. And, when we were talking before the show and you spoke about non-traditional grief, so the definition being any deviation from expectations, that made me stop and think very hard about lots of new possibilities that would open up in that interpretation and that start to maybe explain some of the behavior that I've seen,
Mhm.
that I work with in organizations. And it's sort of the unbudgeted operating cost of change programs, transformation programs, but not only. So can you take us through the sort of operationalization of that realization, Angela? What does it mean for leadership? Where does it show up?
Yes, when I had the realization that all of us are coexisting with this deviation and expectation. So our brains are wired for pattern recognition. We go into any program, any project, we go into it with an intention, with a desired outcome. For most of us, unless we have trained as
Mm,
you know, deep in Buddhism, non-attachment to outcomes is real challenging for most of
yeah.
us. So we go in with this anticipation of what the outcome is going to be. And when there is any deviation from that, this grief shows up for us,
Mm,
but we don't call it that. And not
no.
only do we not call it that, we actually don't even, we don't often even acknowledge that there was a sense of loss there, a loss of expectation. And because of that, what ends up happening is we see all of these undesirable behaviors surface.
Yeah.
Irritability, rumination, micromanagement. We see these qualities in our teams. We see these qualities in our own leadership, and we attribute them to something else.
Mm.
When my undergrad degree is in neuroscience, and so while I'm quite distanced from that part of my training at this point, I do like to take it back to the fundamentals, which is that when something deviates from our expectation, our brains interpret that as a threat.
Yeah.
We see, okay, well, this didn't go as my judgment told me one thing would happen, and then this other thing happened. I'm in a threat mode.
Mm.
And when that happens, the part of our brain that is literally dictating our behavior is the amygdala. It's a
Yeah.
part of the brain that we don't use. We use it. It's our fight, our flight, our freeze. It directs us to do things like that, and that's why you get those behaviors of
Mm.
can't make decisions. I am questioning my own judgment. I'm paralyzed. I'm irritable. I'm lashing out. And you know, when I think about leadership in the setting of grief, as defined as we just said, it's really about how can I get myself and how can I get my team out of that space of the amygdala driven, you know,
Mm.
emotional response and get it back to a place where I can lead from my prefrontal cortex, where logic and that type of cognition is happening. And so when I think about how to operationalize it, that's really, I think the first step is just recognizing that this cascade of events is happening and that the behaviors we're seeing are really just symptoms of an underlying problem that we often ignore talking about. We avoid talking about in mainstream leadership culture.
Mm. And I think, the thought of it as loss was quite interesting to me because loss seems more acceptable in a way than manipulation or frustration or anger. It's okay. So if it's lost, then I have to deal with it. And I think, I never thought of it as loss at all until our conversation. The deviation on expectations, all these
Yeah.
behaviors that you name, which are reactive behaviors, and we see anger, we see frustration, we see people playing politics, we see people disappointed, then disengaged, then burnt out. And I think, leaving it, putting it into a loss discussion almost allows them to do something with it.
I think there is, to your point, say, I think there is something about naming it,
Yeah.
which and naming it loss or grief, which
Mm.
is disarming,
Yes, totally.
right? There's something about uh, calling it what it is and just bringing it to the surface that allows us to disarm it. And I mean, the concept of loss it is innate to being human. And so to your point, I think we can see it less as if we're talking about uh, grief, again, deviation from expectation. It allows us to feel, I guess what I'm trying to get at is I do think that some leaders see discussing vulnerable topics as a loss of authority. And I think if we just start normalizing the use of this existence of
Mm.
grief in the workplace, of deviation from expectation, then it disarms it and we can become more comfortable with it. And not only more comfortable with it, but then recognize that it processing it is truly the only way to keep our teams performing the way that we want them to.
Mm.
And
Mm.
I also think it's just worth mentioning, because it's so unusual, I think, still to call this type of stuff grief. When when a project doesn't go the way that you intended to, when a company has to pivot, when there is a reduction in workforce and a colleague of yours is literally just not present,
Mm.
you go
Mm.
to send them an email and it bounces back. I mean, there are things that happen in our teams that we normalize and we never acknowledge as, oh, from that experience I'm carrying grief. And that's when these types of conversations are relevant. So I think it's just, if we all reflected on even like our everyday Tuesday, you know,
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
types of things are happening.
Yeah. And if I take that, do you think, Angela, that normalizing it like that and sort of putting it back into everyday language and context allows us to break the myth of vulnerability should never be shown as a leader, and it's not the done thing to show vulnerability, it's weak, because I see employees, and I've done it myself, holding grief silently, which
Mhm.
of course you pay a price for, even if you keep it on the inside. So I feel very strongly about breaking this myth of strong leaders don't show vulnerability. And I part of what I liked about the reframe of grief was that for me it may be able to act on breaking down that wall that we have in front of vulnerability in organizations. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. We, as I guess this goes back to neuroscience again, but we as humans are built to co-regulate, meaning we literally have neurons in our brain that respond to the safety signals of other humans.
Mm,
And so when we start to talk about leadership, if if our leaders are unable to normalize for themselves the concept of grief, to address their own grief in their professional journey, to get themselves regulated through acknowledging that this is, a huge part of this is a huge impact on our team's performances. It's almost impossible to expect the rest of our teams to be able to do it because they're looking to that person to set the neuronal tone.
mm,
And I it's so interesting that we have such a hesitancy about again discussing things of this level of vulnerability because ultimately if we saw it as a hard skill, right? If we just acknowledge like our teams cannot be in the right brain space to
mm,
perform their best without this type of conversation, without this type of acknowledgement, without disarming this grief that we're all silently carrying, I think it would become non-negotiable.
mm, mm. Totally. And I was just thinking as you were talking that it's another part that we don't include in leadership development programs that that is inherently human, and that, like you say, creating the brain space. I like that for people to be able to do their best, but also to be able to regulate together in terms of, being able to improve business performance. And if I look at a leader's identity in today's organizational cultures, although it's shifting, I've seen a shift in the last 10 years, but it's still very much about competence, certainty, control. Now, AI is going to shift that massively, but it is still very present. And for me, grief threatens all three because you can't control it. It's about uncertainty, and it's nothing to do with how competent you are. So, what happens if leaders won't let go of that today, Angela?
It's well, you touched on we won't go there yet about the impact of AI, but I think what I see now is if we can't move from that, that fear-based space to a
Mm,
space of rational thinking, of um, again logic. If we can't get out of that space by acknowledging first, we stay stuck. And it's interesting that you're saying that grief threatens control. It's really not, I might say it a slightly different way, which is that unprocessed grief threatens control. If we allow
yeah.
ourselves to acknowledge it first, and this even, and acknowledge the complexity around it,
Mm,
acknowledge how that grief has to coexist um, with gratitude and with some of the other things that are working. If we can do that, then we actually are able to process it and move quicker. I think what I see is we unacknowledged grief just keeps us stuck.
mm,
So people stay in that rumination loop. They stay in a place of regret. They
mm,
stay in a place where they can't actually benefit from any of the loss. And what I mean
mm,
by that is loss, although it's painful, right? You miss a goal, you lose a teammate for one reason or the other. Those things are incredibly painful, but they're also a very important signal about meaning. And I don't think we can move from a place of stuckness to a place of leveraging that meaning without the first step is to acknowledge that it's there.
Mm,
And
mm,
so that's part of what I advocate for, which is just step one is acknowledge that it's there, and then and acknowledge the complexity of it.
mm.
Because if you can't acknowledge the complexity of it, then you can't hold like two truths at once, right?
Yeah.
And that so you have to be able to acknowledge the loss and hold equally true is that there was meaning in that loss, and how do you leverage that meaning to help your team perform better?
Mm, which of course means you need to be in the right, I'm going to steal your word from earlier, brain space. So, if
Yes.
I'm in control, certainty, and delivery mode, and my culture is asking me to do that and keeping that going, deliver, 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 then maybe I'm not in that brain space.
No.
So acknowledging it is a first step to that. But you were talking about holding grief and gratitude at the same time, and I think that's what I call ambidextrous thinking, or polarity management, or holding these two extremes at the same time. And for me, this is a necessary leadership skill, even
Yes.
more so as we step into the sort of more interconnected AI complex world. But it's rare today that people can do that from a practice point of view, but also from the way the culture works point of view in organizations. How do you think leaders can train themselves to do that? What concrete practices could they start? Because and you correct me if you don't agree with this. For me, it's a muscle. It's like going to the gym. You don't just wake up one day and go, "Oh, I can do that polarity thing."
Yeah. I do agree with you that I think it is a muscle. It's a muscle you have to flex, and that has to be exercised regularly, or
Mm,
it's not intuitive. I I do think that part of it starts with language, meaning we don't even. I have only recently become aware of, for example, how important it is when I'm looking at a situation where there was loss. I think in our language pattern, it's much more intuitive to say, um, I, you know, we lost X, but at least blah, blah, blah.
yes.
And instead of saying we lost X and
Mm,
I gave my best effort. And even that switch from using the connector of but to using the connector of and, I think it is, like you said, it is training our brain
mm,
at a fundamental level to believe in the existence of grief and gratitude together.
mm.
Not as a way to uh, because one of the things that I am acutely aware of, I see this often, is that we try to use gratitude as a way to hustle through the loss, right?
Yeah.
Every transition has steps, right? Every transition has steps. The first step of every transition is the loss of something. It's the end of something, it's the death of something, right? And so you have to acknowledge that part of it before you can move on to the other steps of
Mm,
holding duality, using appreciation, leveraging regret. There's a whole transition process.
mm.
So I think using language first and foremost, if we as leaders said to ourselves, I'm going to make a committed effort to acknowledge the polarity of different situations by forcing myself at least to connect those words with and
Yeah.
as opposed to but, I think that could be a great start.
Mm. And I love the idea of, systems exist in the and, they evolve and they live in the and. And if I come to systems thinking and how it works, we're still very much thinking in silos as leaders, aren't we?
Mm.
And organizational culture is still doing things in silos. The systems are giving budgets for procurement, budgets for finance, budgets for this, budgets for that. And, you can sort of collaborate across them, but it's still my budget and my territory and my people. And so, so, how can the and connection help the systems thinking picture, do you think? Because systems thinking remains intangible. It's like, what do you mean systems thinking? How can I, and of course we can read about systems thinking, but I think operationalizing systems thinking is one of the ways of busting myths, like the myth of strong leaders don't show vulnerability because we're connecting different parts of a living system.
Mhm. That's a really great question. As far as I think part of it is, when you start to talk about systems and how they interplay, uh, I think and thinking allows us to reframe a lot of processes
Mm,
that are being measured in one way, but perhaps need to be measured in a different way.
mm,
And what I mean by that is we, most systems exist in an outcomes measured uh, manner.
yeah,
And, obviously, I believe strongly that outcomes do matter.
of course.
I have led in scenarios where outcomes are obviously very important.
Mm,
However, I think it's important to acknowledge that there is outcomes and there is decision-making quality.
mm,
So when I start to think about this at a systems level, it's how do we flex this muscle first on an individual basis, like for my own self, for my team, but then how do we scale it to a system so we can clearly see the duality of something like how do we organizationally make decisions? And rather than being, unilaterally measuring and looking at success based only on outcomes,
mm,
how can we hold the duality
mm,
of let's measure ourselves on outcomes and decision-making quality, rubric process, things of that nature. And so that's where my brain goes when I think about the duality and how do we use that to impact system functioning.
mm. And
Because
we,
that's something that I see a lot is that we have grief from an outcome and we're not holding true the effort or the excellence that existed in the process. So
yeah,
we're focusing all of our attention to the outcome, which to some degree might be outside of our control, without con uh, concurrently recognizing that there was something to be proud of in the process. And so I think that duality is really important.
mm. And if I take the systems constellation school of thought of we need to close things neatly before we join other systems, otherwise you take it with you. I think it's interesting. I don't think we close those conversations either internally or externally enough to move on with a clean slate in inverted commas to a different part of that system. And which brings me to AI,
Yeah.
and it's bringing immense amounts of speed and
Mhm.
a possibility to connect all types of things. And it does give us more time to be more human. But for me, we're not particularly good at that part yet. So, my hope is that that will give opportunities for us to train that muscle. But what do you see AI bringing to this human landscape immediately? Because we don't know what it's going to look like in 3 or 5 years, do we? But if we take that as a backdrop, what are the risks and opportunities that AI is going to bring to that human sort of messy picture?
Yes. So two things. First, I just wanted to make a comment about what you were saying about closing the loop. When I think of the process of how to really process grief in a workplace setting, right? Process that deviation from expectation, the unsavory outcome. There are steps, and the last one, I to me is how do you close that loop? Like how do you, as a team, make a commitment
Yeah.
to doing things going forward? And so it starts with the acknowledgement. That's the important first step, and then there's a series of steps, and then it ends with the commitment to the future. And I do believe that's a really important part of not just processing loss in this setting. I mean, it's an important part of any apology.
Yes.
Without a commitment to doing things better the next time, a tangible way of improving, I think
Mm.
it's hard to feel that the exercise in and of itself is authentic, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, of course.
I think when you talk about closing loops, that is very important.
Mm.
As far as AI, what I'm anticipating is that as it relates to this conversation,
Yeah.
because obviously this could go in a million different directions, AI is increasing how often leaders have to let go of what they thought would work.
Mm,
Right. So when we talk about deviation from expectation in a project, for a teammate, for your identity, I think AI is going to accelerate how frequently leaders are going to have to flex this muscle. And as AI increases in its capacity to do very complicated things for us
mm,
that are even beyond like imagination at this point,
yep.
I think what is going to become even more important is, as you referenced, our ability to process being human and the connection to each other. And now this is going to force us to have to do it at this extremely accelerated rate. So how I'm interpreting that as a leader is it's more important now than ever that I get this correct within myself
Mm,
so that I can model it. Because at the end of the day, as AI continues to do more and more and more, this might be the most important part of leadership is
mm,
how do I help my team continue to function through constant change and loss patterns.
mm. Because I hear a lot of words around it, but I don't see many leaders really acting on it. And my fear is that, we've been dancing around the human element for the last 10 years of management and leadership, and it's moved forward. It has. I've seen loads of change, but we're still not addressing it, and now it's there right in front of us.
Yeah.
So, what would be your advice on actually taking the first step with my team
Yep.
on actually trying to put something in place that will allow us, Angela, to address and start addressing these issues as something we need as an outcome, as something we
Yep.
need to do. It's necessary for business, it's also necessary for people, but it's also necessary for competitive advantage.
I think so, so I think we can talk about two things here. The first is, can we make a core shift away from outcome-based KPIs? And again, this is all in the context of I understand that outcomes matter.
Yeah,
That's
of
table
course.
stakes for being in any high pressure
Mm,
professional setting. So like I understand that outcomes matter, but can we make a core shift away from all of our KPIs and all of our measurement of value being focused on outcomes, and at least start to balance it out with KPIs that reflect decision-making quality,
mm,
reflect the bravery that it's going to take to even make decisions in the setting of this ever-increasing ambiguity, because there's a lot of analysis paralysis, not analysis paralysis, it's decision paralysis, because it's
yep,
not that we have too much information, it's that we have, in the setting of AI especially, we have anticipatory grief about making the wrong decision.
yes.
Right? We are literally anticipating the loss of what's going to happen when and if this is not quote unquote right. And I think part of how we could address that in a very tactical way is measuring, learning to measure and to value just the courage it took to make a well-reasoned decision,
Mm,
regardless of the outcome, which is going to become increasingly more difficult to predict and more difficult to control.
mm,
So that's one very tactical thing
mm,
that I've been trying to work into my world is how can we measure that? How can I signal in a very tangible way, like this is how you are being assessed as a member of the team? And the other, it goes back to a little bit of what we said, which is how creating opportunities
mm,
to acknowledge and kind of go through, I call it the healing protocol, but it's to go through the process of acknowledging the grief. So how can you protect 5 to 10 minutes? I'm not suggesting an hour of therapy. I'm suggesting a very tactical exercise that you do with your team after any setback, right? How do you take just a few minutes to name the reality of what happened? Acknowledge its existence, which is a huge step that doesn't happen right now.
sure.
Often, you acknowledge the duality. So this goes back to the and statements. And There have been exercises where I have literally had my team draw two columns. This is what happened. This is the loss. This is what worked. This is what I'm proud of. And so I can visually see that there is complexity there. There's duality in what existed. I think reframing regret is
Mm.
really important. This goes back to what we talked about before about meaning.
Yep.
So, when you feel that sense of loss, the part that is actionable is it's it's the regret. It's mirroring to you, okay, this was really important to me.
Mm.
And reframing that regret as this is a loss with information, I think is very helpful. Daniel Pink wrote a book called The Power of Regret, and
Yes.
he talks in that book about, I know my reading list over the last couple of years has been
Getting longer and
sounds
longer.
very bad if you take it out of context, but there's a lot of brilliance in that book. But he talks about it's a really interesting review of Olympic medal winners, and obviously gold medal winners are thrilled. Silver medal winners are actually the most unhappy and have the hardest time processing the outcome,
Mm.
whereas bronze winners are also extremely happy. And part of it is because bronze medal winners often say, at least.
Yeah.
They start their understanding of the circumstance with at least statements. At least I made the podium. At least I have a medal. Whereas silver medal winners are likely to say if only statements. So if only I had made a different decision in that moment, I had trained one extra day, etc.
Mm.
So once the grief is acknowledged and space has been held for it, for me in the process that I've kind of put together it's holding space to reframe the regret. So how can we move our teams from a place of if only to a place of at least?
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. Okay.
And then we end that with the commitment to go, what are we going to do differently going forward?
Mm.
So I do think there are exercises that we can be doing. It's not going to, no one of these things is a silver bullet, but I think starting with just a general cultural understanding of this is a really important part of the functioning of our teams, and it's going to become increasingly more important. And here are some tactical things to infuse into daily life.
And that's what does that mean for accountability? Because the other part of this discussion for me is the sort of the blame game that happens when things go wrong or when outcomes are not what we thought they would be. It's automatically, and it's a natural human reaction, isn't it, to go, oh, it wasn't my project, it was his, or it wasn't our fault, it was theirs. How do you put that into that process? Because I think a lot of what happens is we're talking about teams and collective regulation, but objectives are still individual and they're
Mhm.
still performative, and it's very much easier to say it's your fault. But I'm here to help you sort through it, but it's still your fault. So the whole
Mm.
blame game, which of course comes from that defensive place in the brain where you don't want to acknowledge it and you're probably quite scared behind of what's going to happen.
Yes, I mean, whew, that's it's a tough one because it I hate to go back to I hate to sound repetitive, but I think if if one doesn't create a safe environment, none of the things that we're talking about today are going to work. I do think that um, that does start with leadership, and I think part of what you are getting at is again this duality of how do we create a world where outcomes do matter, and so does the effort and the decision making process. How do we hold the two truths?
Mm.
As far as specifically around blame, I do think that some of the things that we've talked about might play out in a more productive way for a team if you have individual conversations first and then do these exercises as a team.
Mhm.
Because I think until we get, again, people out of that amygdala space
Yeah.
and into a space where they can think less defensively,
Mm,
I don't think it's going to be possible to process loss without blame, without that tendency to blame,
mm,
right? So perhaps, you know, and again, leaders have to things like that's on a case by case basis, but I think working with individuals to get them out of that place and then having a team conversation that works this process of letting go of loss, I think that's probably more productive. But it's a great question, and I'm not sure if I have, again, the answer on how exactly do we prevent blame from creeping in.
And my question is twofold, really, because I think about it a lot when we're talking about agentic AI. So, what do we delegate to an agent, and are we still responsible? Where does accountability sit? And
Mhm.
so the more we complicate that process or complexify that process, the more I ask myself what's going to happen to what I call the blame game. that,
Yeah,
that is, that is everybody's go-to because they're not necessarily feeling safe, particularly if outcomes haven't happened as you thought they might.
yeah. It's interesting thought experiment. I have often imagined that one of the last quote responsibilities to be offloaded, if you will, to AI will be like accountability,
Mm,
right? As a physician, I think one of the things, even if we take AI out of it, as medicine has evolved over time,
mm,
we have, medical teams look differently. Nurses might do more now than they did 50 years ago. Scope
mm,
of practice increases for them. We have introduced, advanced practice providers. So, physician assistants and nurse practitioners, they are now part of the team. So the role of the physician has continued as everything has,
mm.
right, over time. But one of the things that has changed less, disproportionately less, has been that ultimately so much of the responsibility of the patient outcome is still on the physician. And so it is one of the factors of the evolution that it's been lagging.
Mm.
And so I think about that in the context of AI, and I imagine that perhaps it'll be the same thing, that we're going to offload all of these complicated processes to AI because that's what it does well.
Yeah,
But it's not going to be able to handle the the complexity of being human, and that responsibility of, again, who's ultimately responsible might be one of the last things to remain.
yeah, yeah. So it's not going to be able to hold polarities. It's not going to be able to metabolize loss. It's not going to be able to make brave decisions when when the
Yeah.
data's finished. So what would
Yeah.
and if I look into the future, and I'm only going to look into the future end of next year because we don't really know.
And that might even be too far. Things are changing too quickly.
I know. Today's AI is the worst AI we're ever going to use because tomorrow it's going to be different and better.
That's right.
But what would your advice be to any leader listening today who wants to start thinking about, who's having a light bulb moment, thinking, "Oh, that's why I was so angry. It wasn't anger. It was loss. I felt that, and that's what's happening in my team." What is one thing that he or she could do differently tomorrow to start addressing how to build that space we were talking about, how to build a space of co-regulation for him or herself and his or her teammates.
I think if we started very small, even if everybody tomorrow went into their place of work and acknowledged that deviation from expectation causes grief.
Mm,
And because of that, everyone on the team has some professional themed grief. I think even just acknowledging with those words
yeah,
and just like just putting it out there and then let individuals reflect on it. Uh, I think that in of itself could be huge.
Mm.
And it really takes someone with uh, it takes someone with authority. It takes someone with a lot of power within the organization to take that first step. And I think if we as leaders walk in, and I say that not because everyone has the opportunity to set the tone,
Of course.
um, but it takes so much more for someone to step out when they don't feel protected by their role within the institution. And so I see it more as a responsibility on leaders, on us as leaders, to take that bold step, just to acknowledge the truth.
Mm.
And I think if individuals are not ready to put something out there, even just to the acknowledgement of its existence, I think part of what we could be doing as individual leaders is reflecting on our own,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
That's not a public choice. That doesn't have to necessarily change anything overtly
Yeah.
for your teams, but just your ability to manage those things within yourself will help to start uh, that co-regulation process
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
more productive way.
Yeah. And I'm going to leave our listeners with that of practicing and getting to know their internal regulation system as
That's
well
right.
before they
Because if we don't
can.
know our own triggers, if we don't
Yeah.
understand, like you said, why we didn't show up in a way that we had hoped for in a certain instance, it's going to be very difficult for us to then try to, implement exercises and things like that with our team. So it definitely starts within ourselves.
Okay. So it's up to each and every one of us to take that step. Angela, thank you so much for coming and sharing your insights and your stories and your experience. Where can people find out more about you and what you do?
I am pretty active on LinkedIn. I would say that's a great place to connect. I've started leading, workshops and things of that nature on these topics. So yeah, if you're interested in learning more or engaging in a more meaningful way, please connect with me on LinkedIn.
Okay, super. And I'll put that link in the show notes. And I would invite you all to connect on this topic because the time is now for me for becoming more human. So, yeah, thank you. Thanks for a great conversation.
Thank you.